Second. Okay, we are recording. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Abdullah Bogara, lead organizer of Melbourne, Brisbane and Adelaide Silicon Beaches and co-organizer of a few other Silicon Beaches around the country like Geelong, Ballarat, Darwin, Launceston. So there are people, this was put on all those meetups, but we have, I think most of the people are from Melbourne today and Brisbane and Sydney. So welcome, thanks everyone for coming. And thanks to the team from Allied Legal. They've been Silicon Beach lawyers for the past couple of years. And they're doing this session especially for Silicon Beaches about general business do's and legal don'ts, I think it's called. I can't remember. But we will be having a lot more of these webinars in the coming weeks and months. Even though we call it a webinar, we are going to have it more like a in-person event and allow you guys to ask questions afterwards. So for the time being, everyone should be muted for the presentation and we will take questions afterwards. I wouldn't be introduced. I'll let Talt and Inda and the team from Allied Legal to introduce themselves and take it away. As for Silicon Beach is concerned, you guys know what Silicon Beach is. We are about empowering founders and we are about helping you guys run your startup or small business or whatever successfully. And legal and business knowledge is valuable for that. So that's why we are having these webinars, even though we are now stuck at home, working from home or wherever. So these online events will continue even after COVID-19. We've got an assurance from Meetup that they will allow us to run online events afterwards. So that is good news. So with that, I'll hand over to Tol to take it away. Just introduce yourself and share your screen.
Thanks, Atul. Am I good to start screen sharing?
Yep.
All right. Okay, that should be live now. All right, everybody, welcome to our presentation on business do's and legal do nots. Before I get into it, I just want to say a big thank you to Atula and the team at Silicon Beach for hosting us today. We love working with these guys. They do so much great work for the startup sector in Victoria and Australia generally. So today we're going to be talking just about some legal and commercial essentials for startups in uncertain times, as you can hopefully see on the first screen of our presentation. But before we get on to that, just a bit about us. Okay, so Allied Legal is made up of myself, Talt, Inder, and Rahul. Rahul founded Allied Legal a couple of years ago. He is a very experienced commercial lawyer, as you can see, over 20 years in commercial law. And he founded Allied Legal with a focus to get involved in the startup sector and small businesses more generally. Inder, the other director of our team at Allied Legal, is a business development specialist. Thanks for the wave, Inder. With, as you can see, over 30 years experience in business development and sales. He has around 20 years experience working with the tech juggernaut IBM, and the last 10 or so years he has been focusing on the startup sector in Melbourne. Him and Rahul came together with a vision of opening up a pretty unique firm which specializes in legal and BD advice for members of the startup sector, which I believe should be most everybody here today. I myself am a commercial lawyer. I've got a background in BD and I have a background in marketing. So that's enough about us. Let's get on to the good content. So we're going to be doing a basic rundown of the developments and implications that we've seen from the COVID-19 pandemic, just on the sort of legal landscape and commercial landscape. I'm going to take you through a bit of the impact on commerce generally, look at some of the impacts on commercial leases, and then we're going to talk about the commercial implications of COVID-19 around fundraising for startups and around employment relationships and employee schemes. I'm going to pass it on to Inder, and he's going to give you guys a very thorough rundown of business development and sales approaches generally and in uncertain times such as these. And like Atula said at the beginning, feel free to ask questions throughout or save them for the 20-minute Q&A that we have booked for the end. So the first thing that I want to talk about today is the impact on commercial transactions that we've been seeing coming out of this, really, really unique and unfortunate pandemic, the coronavirus. Um, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is commercial contracts. Two key concepts, which I want you guys to be familiar with when it comes to commercial contracts, are called a force majeure, which is essentially translates into superior force, and frustration. These are both mechanisms which allows parties to a commercial contract to either vary or change or otherwise get out of a contract based on extenuating circumstances. A force majeure, it's not just a common law principle. That is a specific type of clause which people will put into contracts, which says, in these circumstances, these things will happen. Think of it like a contingency plan, if you will. So if your contract has a force majeure in there, that might account for extreme things such as war or natural disasters, government shutdowns like we've been experiencing. Now, you might be able to leverage that sort of provision in a contract to either vary or get out of your contractual obligations. But if you want to rely on that, it's going to come down to the specific wording of what is actually contained in that force majeure clause. Things that you're going to want to look out for are terms such as health crisis, international crisis, state of emergency, stoppage of work, the sort of things that we've been experiencing under this coronavirus pandemic. If those are somehow accounted for in the force majeure clause, then you might be able to use that to leverage your way either out of a contract or to get some sort of amendment or variation made to that contract. If you don't have a force majeure and you need to find your way out of a contract, the other principle that you can rely on is called frustration. And it sounds like what it is. It's when a contract is frustrated to a point that one party can't complete their obligations under that contract because of the frustration. What does that basically mean? If something happens which completely prevents a party from performing that contract, then it's basically unfair at law to require them to perform that contract. Now, whether or not coronavirus would actually be a frustrating event for that purpose is going to depend on your specific circumstance. I mean, if you want to say that the coronavirus has just had a negative impact on your business overall, that might not cut it. But if your work has been shut down and you literally can't perform the work, that's going to be a pretty sound argument. But in fairness, that's not to say that, you have to have been completely shut down to rely on frustration. And that's where I want to talk about this next point, commercial leverage. So I'm going to bring up an example from a case that we worked on recently here at Adelaide Legal. We had a client who was looking to buy a business, and he had already entered into the contract to sell for that business, and the sale was coming up around the corner. But the sale was obviously entered into before the coronavirus pandemic happened, and he needed to delay by anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months just to sort of get his affairs in order. Now, there wasn't a force majeure clause in that contract, and the frustration argument wasn't what you would call a slam dunk. I mean, it wasn't necessarily arguable that it was completely impossible to perform the obligations under that contract, that obligation being actually proceeding to buy the business. Nonetheless, we are able to leverage the principles around frustration to the commercial advantage of our client. So the key point here is that you can use these concepts in a commercially savvy way to negotiate yourself into a better deal. The realistic position was kind of different from the legal position, in that the legal position was that if this actually went to court, whether frustration would have held up as an argument, well, that would have been a matter for the courts to decide. But if it had gone to court, that would have delayed things quite significantly. It would have cost both the parties a lot of money. And at the end of the day, it was in the best interest of both parties to agree to the delay, or rather the postponement of the settlement, and proceed to the sale on those grounds. And that ended up being what happened. Now, this example is pretty common in what we've been seeing in our casework since the pandemic has begun. Either we have clients coming to us saying that they need to leverage their way out of a situation, or a counterparty to a contract that they are a part of is trying to get out of a situation on account of the coronavirus. So it's going to be something which pops up pretty frequently. Now, this is either fortunate or unfortunate, depending on what side you are on, but changing market conditions aren't generally grounds to cancel a contract. But like we advised our clients, you can leverage your position using these principles like frustration and force majeure to negotiate yourself a better situation. What's really key here, though, is that you make sure that you have sound legal advice so you really know your commercial position. You can't just go through, throwing out arguments willy-nilly. You really need to make sure that you're in a position to be asking for what you're asking for, and that if you're successful, this will be to your benefit, and it's also going to be agreeable to the other side. Otherwise, they will most likely pursue that in court. So another example of this was a client of ours who was offered to buy into a company based on the valuation for that company that was made prior to the coronavirus pandemic happening. Now, unsurprisingly, the actual value of that company has changed as a result of our new market conditions under the coronavirus. So the question here is whether that buyer is still required to buy in at the pre-COVID valuation, or whether he can somehow leverage his way into buying in at a lower valuation under these new market conditions. And as is always the case, finding a solution for this isn't just going to be a straightforward matter of applying some law or some case. It's going to be a combination of applying the common law, applying statutory law, with good negotiation practices and commercial approach. What we want to do when we negotiate these sort of things is come up with a solution which works well for both parties, so that way everybody feels like they've won and the contract can proceed on the best terms as possible. Now, another development which adds to this sort of uneasy commercial situation is the changes that we've seen to the litigation process and court processes. Usually, if you can't settle something in the negotiation phase, or if you can't just work it out, one client will try to take the other client to court. But obviously, going to court at the moment, that sort of violates a lot of the social distancing requirements that have been put in place. So the courts themselves have had to completely revamp their systems and how they operate things. Some of these changes include that the court registry is currently only available by appointment. Most matters are being heard on the papers as opposed to actually going to court, and urgent and short matters are being given priority over all other matters. So the impact of all this is that it really makes it harder for one party to make a claim against another party. This gives parties to a commercial contract leverage when a claim is being brought against them, because it will often be more commercial advantageous to settle in pre-trial negotiations than it will to try and take somebody to court. So that's something which commercial parties can leverage when they find themselves in disputes. Everybody knows that the more difficult, more expensive option is always going to be going to court. And right now, during these current coronavirus, revamp that the court has undergone, that's only going to be even more so. So that's sort of the framework around which we've been seeing commercial transactions developed under coronavirus. And look, the key takeaways from this is that, firstly, if you're parties to a contract and those contracts have been significantly changed because of this environment, find out what sort of clauses are in there, find out if there's a force majeure clause in there, and if not, see if you can rely on the principles of frustration. If none of those are slam dunks, that doesn't mean that you've completely lost your situation. Use the current environment to negotiate your way into a situation which suits you best. And of course, seek legal advice if you can, because that's always going to help you out when it comes to negotiating a better position. So the next thing that I want to talk to you guys about is the impact that we've seen on commercial leases. I mean, this is something which is relevant to a lot of people who are working in a commercial capacity, running their own business. And we've seen a lot of interesting changes here based on this code of conduct that the government has released around commercial leases. So the main points are up here on the screen. And those are that landlords of a commercial tenancy are now required to give a reduction in rent, which is equivalent to the loss of business which has been experienced by their tenants. And that reduction is going to come in two forms. Half of it is going to be a waiver, and the other half is going to be a deferral. Now, a waiver is just a complete forgiveness of the debt. That means that it's never going to be repayable. And the tenant just gets to enjoy that permanent decrease in their rent. The other half of that, though, the deferral, will eventually be repayable after the Australian government declares the pandemic to be over, accounting for a reasonable adjustment period. So this means that, say that your business has suffered a 50% decrease in turnover. Well, if your rent was, let's make it an easy number, $1,000 a week, it will be reduced to $500 a week. 250 of that reduction will never be repayable, and the other 250 you will have to repay eventually at the end of that, at the end of the pandemic, according to the Australian government's declaration. There are some uncertainty that comes from this. One of them being how are businesses meant to show their loss of business, and how are they meant to demonstrate that to their landlord? This might be particularly difficult for startups because a lot of the time they haven't been around for a matter of years to be able to demonstrate a loss relative to a previous period of the last financial year. But that doesn't mean that this is fatal to them. As with the JobKeeper payment, which I'll talk about later, the government is willing to assess these things on a case-by-case basis, as long as a tenant or a business can reasonably demonstrate that their revenue has decreased or is expected to decrease. So that's definitely something to keep in mind if you're going to be looking for a reduction in rents. If you haven't been around for a year or longer, you need to think of a really strong way to demonstrate that you have experienced a loss of profit that is a result of the coronavirus. So definitely something important to keep in mind there. Okay, so the commercial leases aren't the only relief that the government has announced for companies. There are a couple of really interesting new policies being put in place around companies which are in debt and around insolvency trading. So the first one that I'm going to talk about, which you'll see on the screen, is a moratorium on a statutory demand. You might be wondering what a statutory demand is. It's basically a document which is issued by a creditor, which is someone who is owed money, and they issue it to a debtor, which is somebody who owes that person money. And then the statutory demand demands the repayment of that debt. Now, typically, if that money is not paid within the relevant time, that company is deemed insolvent, and then that puts it at risk for a whole bunch of things, including entering administration or liquidation. The usual debt threshold to be able to issue a statutory demand was $2,000. Now this has been increased to $20,000, and that's a really significant increase. I mean, that's by 10 times. So previously, if you owed somebody $2,500, they could issue you a statutory demand, and if you couldn't pay this, you could be claimed insolvent. But now that amount's gone up to $20,000. And when I mentioned before that if you don't pay it off within that relevant period, that period used to be 21 days, and now that's been extended to 6 months. So again, that is quite a significant increase, meaning it is a lot harder now for companies to claim debt against smaller companies that owe it to them. Couple this with the changes that have been made to the court system and the fact that, right now the market situation under coronavirus is so uneasy, things are going to get harder and harder for companies to claim debts from smaller companies. So these are all good things to keep in mind. Say that you owe some debt from your startup business and somebody's chasing you down on that. The point of these things is for companies to survive this period and bounce back with greater viability at the end of it. So the government is putting these things in place to try and protect small businesses and allow them to survive this period. But these things aren't going to be permanent. They're only going to last for a period of 6 months. Now, this also goes for the leeway on insolvent trading. So companies enjoy something which is called the corporate veil. That means that if you're a director of a company, you don't have liability for that company's debts. That's the general rule. There are some exceptions to that rule. One of them, as you'll see on the screen, is that directors are usually personally liable if a company trades while insolvent. That means that if they trade while insolvent, the director's house, their assets, their own private money in their bank accounts could be at risk if they break this rule. There are other exceptions in the Corporations Act as well, but we won't get into that right now. Now, under these new relief for businesses in distress, directors are going to be relieved from this liability for a temporary period of 6 months. So that means that they will be able to continue trading even if they are insolvent for a 6-month period, without exposing themselves to any personal liability. This, coupled with the moratorium on statutory demand, is putting small businesses now in a really good situation where, even though the market might not be looking so great, well, they have a lot more breathing space than they would have under usual policies on things like insolvent trading and statutory demands. Now, notwithstanding, directors will still be personally liable for dishonest or fraudulent trading. I've written that verbatim on the screen because that's a really important point to emphasize. These don't mean that directors can get away with, skeezy wheeling and dealing. They still have to be doing the right thing. It's just giving them some breathing room when it comes to the situations where they're owed debts, and because of this new market, they might not be able to pay those debts off straight away. Now, on the topic of governments helping us all out, I want to talk to you guys about a couple of the grants that the government has put forward and how helpful that can be when it comes to companies raising funds. So the first one, which I'm sure we all know and love given how much media attention it's been given over the last couple of weeks, is the JobKeeper. So the JobKeeper Fund is available for businesses with an annual turnover of less than $1 billion that have or are reasonably expecting a 30% decrease in turnover. It's also available for businesses with a turnover of more than $1 billion that have a 50% decrease in their annual turnover. Now, the JobKeeper payment is $1,500 per an employee per fortnight, but it's not just for companies. It also applies for sole traders. So if you're a sole practitioner or the sole director of a company, you can still qualify for that JobKeeper payment. This grant raises some difficult questions for startups. Similar to the leasing one, how the government is going to be assessing them is based on the turnover relative to a period of a year ago. But for startups which are new and which haven't been around for a year, they're going to have less certainty on whether or not they can qualify for these grants. But again, that's not to say that it's fatal. The government has said that as long as these startups can reasonably demonstrate a decrease in turnover or an expected decrease in turnover, they can still be eligible. So once again, something very important to keep in mind if you're going to be applying for these is how you're going to demonstrate a decrease or expected decrease in turnover. Now that same thing goes for the next one, which is the Business Support Fund grant, which is up to a $10,000 grant for small businesses. They're eligible if they employ staff and they have been subject to closure or are highly impacted by the shutdown, and they have a turnover of between 75 grand and have a payroll of less than $650,000. Again, though, it's going to be the same difficulty in terms of demonstrating how they have decreased in their annual turnover. I don't need to repeat that, but again, something to keep in mind. Another grant, or less of a grant, more of it's a cash flow boost is what it's been called, is going to be provided to small and medium businesses in the form of tax breaks of between $20,000 and $100,000. The great thing about this one is that you don't have to apply for it. When you do your business activity statement, as long as you're eligible, that those credits will be automatically applied to your business. There are some requirements, though, in order to actually be eligible for that, which includes you have to have held an ABN on the 12th of March and continue to be active. Okay, we are running short on time. I'll keep moving through these ones. The last one is the assistance for affected regions and sectors. Now, this one is fairly new and the government hasn't expanded on it too much yet, so this is something to keep an eye on, but it's going to be around $1 billion in some sort of bonuses or grants for industries that have been severely affected by the coronavirus. The main three industries that they're putting forward for this are agriculture, education, and tourism. So if you're a startup operating in one of those sectors, this is definitely something to keep an eye on. When it comes to raising funds generally, we've seen that there's been an increased difficulty, which is unfortunately unsurprising given the current markets. Potential investors are less likely to let go of money with how much uncertainty there is around the economy. But that isn't to say that getting funding at the moment is impossible. We've seen a lot of successful fundraising out of agile and adaptable businesses that are able to either offer a product which is useful or adapt their current product to make it useful in the current environment. For example, we had a client who developed an app for online delivery in the retail sector. As soon as the shutdowns and social distancing requirements were put in place, they showed innovation and initiative to adapt that app to facilitate contactless shop and curbside pickups for retail customers. So even throughout this economic distress, they've been successful in raising funds and finding new clients for this product. We've also seen success in smaller rounds of fundraising. So this shows that there's still opportunistic investing going on, but mostly for solid startups with an existing client base or existing revenue. Startups with existing revenue have demonstrated a better success rate when it comes to raising these funds in smaller rounds. So it's good to know that there still is opportunity out there to get fundraising. And the last thing that I want to talk to you guys about before I pass it on to Inder to take you through the business development things is some employee and employment considerations when it comes to running your company. So the first one that I want to talk about is the idea of standing down employees. There are pretty specific requirements in the Fair Work Act about when you can and cannot stand down an employee. But what you need to know is that if you're an employer, you can stand down your employee. That means send them home and stop them from coming to work without pay if there is a stoppage of work that the employer is not responsible for. So that might be pretty clear cut at the moment. If you're in a business which has been deemed non-essential and shut down, then you can stand down your employees without being required to pay them. Or if you have an employee who is infected with the coronavirus or has been in contact with somebody who is infected with the coronavirus, well, they're required by law to self-isolate for 14 days, and anybody who has been in contact with them is required by law to self-isolate for 14 days. So again, that's another example where you can stand them down without having to pay them. If though an employee is willing to work and they're able to work, you can't stand them down without pay. So that's definitely something to keep in mind if you have employees that you need to manage. The other aspect, the other side of the coin for employees in coronavirus is how employee entitlements are being dealt with in the current climate. What we're seeing, which is really interesting, is that there's a greater propensity for companies to actually look at offering entitlements such as profit sharing arrangements or equity in companies, as opposed to a higher pay or a higher salary. This is a really good thing because it gives employees a greater stake in the company that they work for, and it motivates them to work for that company. So if you're a startup looking to bring on more employees, but you're worried about being able to meet their salary expectations under the coronavirus market, offering them an entitlement or an equity or a profit sharing scheme is definitely something to consider. However, make sure that any such entitlement is properly drafted by an agreement. You don't want to get into a situation where your employee is claiming more than you've actually agreed to them, or for whatever reason, the agreement that you've come to looks like something which it isn't. We had a client who entered a profit sharing agreement, which actually started to look like a partnership agreement. And that comes with a whole litany of other legal and financial implications. So if you're going to do a profit sharing arrangement, or if you are a party to a profit sharing arrangement, just make sure that, it's drafted correctly with the proper legal work. So those are the basic rundowns of legal developments and legal implications under the coronavirus. I'm going to pass it now on to Inder, who's going to talk.
Hey, Tal, what I was just thinking is, I was just reading through some of the chats, and I think there's some questions as well. I was almost thinking, just because you went into some meaty content, if it makes sense to just take a couple of questions first before I move on to mine.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Rahul, I might get you to jump on these questions with me as well. Let's have a look here.
Just given the time in there, why don't I'm just conscious it's 11:35, and Attila mentioned they've got another presentation after this. Why don't you get onto yours, and then maybe we can spend sort of 5-10 at the end on questions.
Yeah, that's fine. Sure.
Yeah.
So I'll stop sharing, Inder, so you can take over the screen.
Sure.
While Rahul is, Inder is getting ready, if anyone has any more questions, feel free to type them in chat. Is anyone here from Adelaide, by the way? Type in chat because I want to find out whether there was a timing problem was resolved. Okay, take it away, Rahul.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, Inder. Yeah.
All right, good stuff. All right, good morning, everybody. I hope first of all everybody is safe out there, and thanks for going through the legal piece. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about sales and business development, and I guess it's kind of an interesting combination as to why we're doing legal and also business development today. I actually, interestingly, I joined forces with Rahul about 2 months ago. And it was probably about, look, I've been part of the ecosystem for the past 2 years from a startup perspective. And what I've really found is it's been great kind of being part of this community. There's been a lot of support, especially at the times we're going through right now. As we've just kind of started our business kind of 2 months ago, what we decided to do was start focusing on kind of establishment and also expansion services, right? And I guess kind of being founders out there, it comes with a lot of challenges, right? And along that way, I guess what you're trying to do obviously is their success. And I think the measure of success, as the times we're in right now, is also kind of evolving and changing as well. In some cases, you can kind of think about profit, but you could also think about purpose as well, right? And it is a journey, it is a map that we're kind of all going on as well as we're kind of doing this. But sales can be very difficult at this time, right? And so what I thought I'd do today is just kind of like widen the aperture a little bit from a sales perspective, and just kind of spend a little bit of time talking about how to, should you be prospecting in this climate? If you are prospecting, how do you go about it, and what we're hearing, right? And by the way, we're going through this ourselves, right? It's being kind of a newly formed business in terms of as we're kind of growing too. And we're meeting with a number of businesses as part of the ecosystem. We probably do about 2 or 3 meetings a day with various startups, and a lot of them are having challenges both from an establishment perspective, but also in terms of how they're looking to expand in the climate we're in right now, right? I thought I'd just kind of like broaden this a bit further as well in terms of there's a great book called The Third Wave by Steve Case, which I had a chance to read, and and it's interesting, but he kind of goes through the 3 waves, right? The first wave was probably from the 80s. The second wave was in the 2000s, in the Y2K, and then 2016 was kind of the third wave. The third wave is really around kind of building the internet, right? Kind of laying the foundation for the online kind of world. So that would be like the Apples, the IBM, the Microsofts of the world, right? In the 2000s, it was all around the app economy and also the mobile revolution. So the likes of the Amazon, the Facebooks, and the Google, right? 2016 is really the internet everything. That's like where connectivity is allowing entrepreneurs to kind of transform major and real world sectors. It was interesting, right? But I'm almost thinking now we're almost like getting either we're getting into a 4th wave with what's happening now, or the 3rd wave, right, is being accelerated in some cases, right? In that case, it could be things around from a healthcare perspective. I know there's a startup, probably a scale up now, out of South Australia in Adelaide, and they were actually working on helping monitor patient care, especially for those that were kind of going into surgery, coming out of surgery. It was a big challenge. And it can be, by the way, can be really a big challenge right now in terms of just being able to sell into the healthcare and the hospitals, right? I mean, the demand of trying to get attention from somebody can be very challenging. And it comes back down to, is it about profit or is it about purpose? And are you there trying to actually genuinely help and make a difference, right? This one startup, right, slightly pivoted, changed some of their SaaS applications, right, to actually help with triaging, but also what happens when somebody leads based on being diagnosed, right? And they got the attention of the CEO from the hospital and being able to kind of get that going. But again, that was there to kind of help the community out, right? So at times like this, I think there is opportunity. Just got to be careful about how you kind of take that approach, right? What I thought I'd do as well is, just as we're kind of going into this, I thought just to get us onto an equal footing, I just kind of cover off a few kind of basic sales concepts, right? just so think about it as just to get us onto an equal footing here. What I'll be talking about today will primarily be more around from a sales perspective versus marketing, right? And when really we'll be speaking more to B2B sales. So from a marketing perspective, you're probably thinking about branding, creating awareness or interest, lead nurturing and generation, and having some form of sales support. From a sales perspective, this is where you're actually having direct client contact, scoping projects, closing contacts, or client advocate, right? Now, traditionally, right, sales would probably be, in some cases, was actually done from a face-to-face perspective. That direct client contact is in fact starting to evolve and change. I'll talk about that as well, right? And this, and by the way, do not try to read everything on here. I won't go through all of it. The intention over here is just to speak to the fact that there are a number of different, so when you look at large organizations that have lots of different specialized sales roles, there's a number of roles that exist within sales. And as a founder of a startup, right, or of a business, there's probably a number of hats that you're going to be wearing. In some cases, it could be very specialist sales roles that you're performing and wearing multiple hats on as well. The left side of this is primarily field sales, right, where you're actually doing in-person meetings, right? The right side is primarily inside sales, or what we're calling now is more kind of a digital sales, where you have inbound and outbound. Just know that from a sales perspective, there are a lot of different hats that you may be playing along the way as you're kind of going out there to the market. And if you look at the left side, you'll also see, from a major account perspective, there's hunters and there's also farmers, right? So, are you there to try to drive new business, or are you there really to kind of keep your current clients, keep them happy, and make sure they're on track, and that they're driving their goals and their outcomes as well? And so you probably want to think about that in terms of from a founder perspective, because a lot of times the founder will be the person that's selling. Are you there driving new business, and how much time are you going to be doing that versus actually kind of taking care of the current clients you have already, right? And in some cases, if you are looking to hire, or you have hired, or you have an organization, where are you spending time in terms of directing your teams towards each as well, right? Right. So now we've kind of talked a little bit about a high level about sales and marketing. We've talked a little bit about the different types of sales roles. At the same time, there's also different types of styles of people as well that approach sales, right? This was something that was done about 2 years ago, and they had interviewed about 10,000 sales professionals across the globe, across various countries. Just looking at the various sales professionals and styles that exist when you kind of go to market, right? And what they also looked at the performance of each of these styles in terms of, were they top performers or were they core performers? As they went through this, right, the purpose for kind of putting things out there is saying there's different types of people that sell in different ways, and what's really required in the climate that we have today, right? And it's really kind of taking some of those roles that exist and the styles that exist, and saying to yourself, this is probably where your strength is, but you may want to perhaps build on a second style as well in terms of how you kind of approach the market, right? And the challenger role was actually an interesting one, right? Because the challenger style is the one where you are, you always have a different view of the world. You understand the customer's business. You love to debate. You push the customer, but you have to be careful with that, right? In how you're approaching your conversations, how you're going to market, and the messaging you're kind of bringing to the surface as well. The other thing is, which I find interesting in the climate we're in right now, is the sales process, right? And just going back to kind of some basics that exist from the sales level, right? And it could just come down in terms of, what is a lead, first of all? So a lead is a person or a business that may eventually become a client. And how do you know that you actually have a qualified lead? Well, you use this formula which has existed for some time called BANT, which is budget, authority, need, and timing, right? And a lot of times, if you fall back on the process and the formulas, it kind of helps to give you a gauge of where you are in the sales process, and is this something that you should be moving forward on as well with your prospect, right? So as an example, let's say you're purchasing a car. You go to if you were going to a dealership, and we kind of use that as an example. The dealer may be asking you, do you have the funds to be able to do this? Are you the authority, or do you need your partner involved in the decision making? Right? Is there a specific need? For example, you may be expecting, or your partner may be expecting, and therefore there may be a need. And maybe when you do, if you're looking at purchasing a van, for example, right? So a BANT is a kind of a quick way depending on the size of the transaction and the type, the organization you're trying to kind of tackle, it might be one way to be able to kind of size up whether or not you actually have an opportunity or a deal, the timing for that. So it'll help you kind of prioritize the time and where you're spending the time as well. Right? As part of that process from a sales level, there is the overall kind of lead generation model, right? Which again starts off with, you know, whether you're doing some form of branding, PR, advertising. We're seeing lots of different things coming on TV today. You know, whether it's the airlines that are still kind of keeping in touch with us and putting ads out, whether it's Uber saying, you know, thanks for not driving with us, and whether you're using SEO websites and direct mail along those ways as well. There's actually a funnel that exists to the point where it eventually leads to some form of a marketing qualified lead, to a sales qualified lead, and hopefully to a customer, right? And on the right-hand side, some of these metrics can actually kind of help you if you have been tracking it in the past, in terms of getting an idea of the marketing funds or the sales funds that you may have to put some money towards, and what type of results that may drive, right? And I always find that having, again, the sales process, because again, sales can be a very tough, and it's very tough in the climate we're in right now as well. Falling back on some form of a process, right, or building a process can actually help, right, in actually furthering your gains, right? And with that, what I tried to do was, based on the conversations that we've been having so far with a number of different clients, based on talking to those within the network and reaching out for help, what I thought I'd do is just put together a bit of a kind of pandemic sales checklist. I won't go through all that, so we have a bit of time for questions as well, but I will go through just a few of the items, right? And these are just things that may kind of help out with, right? One is, we are in a tough climate right now, so accept that this will be slow and hard. What I always find is when times are tough and you do put the hard work in to actually plan out your approach, it can help in terms of when things get better and things bounce back as well, because you've taken the time to actually work through some things that could have been very difficult to do. And then when things do rebound in some way, and you know, if there's some form of normalcy that comes from this as well, that can actually help to kind of further your business as well, right? The other thing is commit to a long-term sales mindset, right? So you may want to think about this from a versus a transactional perspective. You may want to think this more from a strategic partnership perspective and making some of those investments with your clients, right? The other one is to choose to practice compassion, empathy, and patience, right? I will just tell you, kind of being in sales for many years and actually coaching salespeople and leading sales teams as well. You know, a lot of times a salesperson actually, especially when they're quota carrying, a lot of times what they're thinking about is, you know, will I get this deal? Will I close this deal? Will I get this deal? Will I close this deal? At the end of the day, that will help their quota. At the end of the day, that will help them pay their bills and their mortgages, right? But in today's climate, I think we have to kind of reevaluate that in some cases as well, and really think about the customer, right? Are we genuinely there working on things that are solving the customer's problems, right? And with that, also being authentic. I will tell you that, you know, customers can absolutely pick up on the fact that if you're being a sleazy salesperson, or if you're genuinely there to kind of help them with their business, right? And I think now is really the time to kind of be authentic and show empathy and patience as well, and be very careful, right, with the messaging that you're bringing forward as well, right? I know when the lockdown started taking place, I was seeing things on TV as well, just from a commercial perspective. I'm saying, why are these commercials on TV at this point in time? It makes absolutely no sense, right? So it's very careful, even from a messaging perspective. If you are putting, you know, mailers out and you are doing promotion, be very careful with your messaging, right? And that with that comes, you know, show the love to your current clients, because right now, you know, your current clients are probably the ones that are paying the bill. And so it's very important that you are there, right? Making sure that you're taking care of them first, and looking to ways to kind of help them, right? The other one is, if you are going to be doing some form of kind of cold sales or prospecting, crafting a very kind of high value offer. So it has to be something, because there is still noise out there from your client's perspective, whether it's in the enterprise area, whether it's in the SMB, whether it's within the finance sector, distribution, or wholesale. You really want to make sure that you are resonating very specifically with some high value offers that are meaningful, and actually something that would be something that would that would align and fit, right? The other one is around building strength and referral partnerships, right? So from this, yes, you know, it's really going to take a team in some cases, right? And also your ecosystem to kind of tap into, to kind of work together and to harness those relationships, because that will, in some ways, you can help each other out. And a lot of times, you really can't help, you know, a client with everything from your perspective. It actually helps to have that network in place as well, right? And I think the final thought here is just recognize that you'll likely survive this, right? We have gone through a lot in the past, right? Whether it's been the GFC, which is more economical, and from this perspective, it is around health and also economy as well, and from a finance perspective. And you know, from everything that I'm hearing so far, especially we're very lucky in the community that we're in right now from a technology perspective. There's a lot of impact that we can bring to our communities and also to each other and to the world. From what I'm seeing, you know, we're actually lucky where we are from an Australian perspective, and I think there's an opportunity here where I think things will get better. I'm not sure what the new normal will look like, but it's just a matter for us to kind of persevere and go through this. And with that, that was just my bit here to talk a little bit about open up the aperture a little bit further from a sales perspective and how to reach out to clients. So I think what we can do now is, if you're all still there, is just talk a little bit about, take some questions as well, either from a legal perspective or from a business development perspective.
Inder, I might as well kick it off.
Sure.
One of the things that I thought would be useful is for you to give a bit of a generic overview of. I mean, we're dealing with startups on a daily basis at the moment that are struggling with how do you get customers and leads and traction in a market like this, right? And do you want to give a little bit of an overview of some of the practical things that you do and help with to and making it quite clear to these startups that selling right now and at least being visible right now is important. How you're doing that and how you a couple of practical tips on that.
Yeah, look, I think from a practical perspective, it probably starts with, first of all, trying to get a meeting, right? Because if you can't get the meeting going, it's going to be really tough to be able to engage, right? And it takes time to kind of think about what is your offer, what are you bringing to the market, and doing a little bit of research in terms of who is it, what is your sweet spot that you think from a client perspective. There's a number of areas that you can kind of boil the ocean in, and you probably want to narrow that scope and the aperture down a bit further as well in terms of kind of thinking through who are some of those clients and reaching out to them. You probably want to do a little bit of research as well in terms of the verticals that you may be going after. So whether if it's within finance or if it's within distribution, kind of just getting yourself up to speed in terms of what are some of the pain points that they're feeling right now, that they haven't been feeling before, and what they're feeling right now. Looking back at some of the offers that you may have as well, and trying to see if those offers should be adjusted. And then thinking through about who are the people within that enterprise or within those accounts, right? That this message or this may resonate with. In some cases, they may be influencers. In some cases, they may be decision makers. In some cases, it could just be picking up the phone just to have that conversation, you know, within that specific sector as well, right? And then when you are, then it's actually going through a process of being able to reach out, but you have to be careful in how you're going about getting those meetings as well. What I find is, obviously, you know, many of us are on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is a great place to kind of start with and kind of forming those connections as well. The other one is, as you are forming your kind of referral network, is reaching out to your partners within the channel and looking for introductions and warm introductions, which is something that we've been doing as well through that process.
And there another question I had for you, something which I found, oh wait, we have a question here from John in the chat.
Go ahead, John.
So John has asked, I believe the startup environment has issues with the marketing of their value proposition before having a walk in the park for sales. What are your thoughts on that?
So I missed the first part of that.
It's in the chat, if you can see it in the chat.
I cannot with the current share.
Already.
Hold on. I cannot see it.
The question is whether I believe the startup environment has issues with the marketing of their value proposition before having a walk in the park for sales. What do you think?
So can you just clarify that a bit further, John, in terms of when you're saying, you know, the walk in the park part?
I'm trying to unmute you. John, can you unmute yourself? No, I'm having problems.
Yeah, Enda? Yeah?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, Enda, it's what I'm saying. What I'm trying to, well, question towards you is the following. You talked about the AI, the concept, right, of marketing, awareness, etc., and then acceptance by the customer. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of startups, what I've noticed in time is that they're having issues with marketing their value proposition. So you as a truly, well, experienced sales, you know that if the marketing is done correctly and professionally, it's a walk in the park for sales, because in general, 60-70% of that effort you have to put into sales is be taken away by a professional marketing approach, right? So that's really where I'm coming from. This is what I've seen in many startup environments, is the marketing of their value proposition regarding kind of social media. Because what I see, what you're proposing there, you're talking about clients, but a lot of these people don't have clients. Going back to what Tolt said initially, we're talking about a startup environment which has no revenues. So what they're trying to do, they're trying to create revenues, and that's where the marketing comes in. But the marketing is hardly there. They'd rather take on a rep than take on a marketing expert to market their concept. And this is where a lot of the startups just go overboard and miss what it's really about, because they have to create the awareness and create the actions from potential customers.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I think I understand what you're saying now as well, right? And you're absolutely right. I mean, it does help to have some form of like marketing air cover. If it's done right, it will actually help from a sales proposition perspective, and it does become a walk in the park.
Exactly.
But there is still lots that have to get done as well. I will say that from an early stage startup perspective, right? And especially I guess you have to look at it from a startup perspective. There is a realm in terms of, are you pre-revenue or are you post-revenue as well?
Yeah.
Or the journey as well, right? For those startups that actually don't have customers yet and don't have revenue, right? At the same time, what you do still want to be talking to potential clients. You're going to need to do that even from a validation perspective as well, right? So even as you're validating your offer and trying to get to market, to market fit, right?
Yeah.
You still need to be talking to some form of clients and not doing this in a silo. So still getting those meetings, right? Still hearing about what they require is still important. And I can also say it's all, a lot of times there is angst that exists between sales and marketing, right? It is actually important. And I'm working with organizations today as well that kind of go through this as also, where it's important for sales to do that outreach early on with some clients, right? That perhaps do fall into that sweet spot, to perhaps bring those messages back to marketing as well. In some cases, perhaps recraft that message as well.
Yeah, close the loop. Yeah, I agree with you 100%. So feeding back the information into marketing so they can maybe do a rerun of a prospect who wasn't interested initially.
That's correct.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from.
Right. Yeah. But again, and I would say this as well, right? So when I was using the words kind of client in my presentation, at the same time, this could actually be used not only from a revenue perspective, but it can also be used from a validation perspective as well. Yeah. Trying to get meetings with potential clients, even to do research and validation, is equally hard right now as well. But at the same time, I will say there is still appetite out there. with people being in lockdown, in some cases, I was trying to talk to a government client recently as well, who I've been trying to chase for a year, right? Finally, this past, a week ago, was finally able to get a meeting with him because he had some time to meet, right? And the message was aligned as well in terms of the pain points he was going to as well, right? So I would say whether it's pre-revenue or post-revenue, I think trying to reach out and not doing this in silos is very important, and getting that feedback mechanism is important as well.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks a lot for your answer. Appreciate it.
Thanks for the question.
Any other questions? There's some in chat. I'm not sure whether they're questions or just comments.
If I do stop, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Was there a question? I can see the chat now. I figured it out. It was hiding in the more. All right.
Anyone, if you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask. There's a hand up icon as well. I can't find it now. I think normally you find it under participants. You can put your hand up, raise hand function. We have about 5 minutes. I can give about 5 minutes or 8 minutes till 12:10 because our next webinar is at 12:30. But I need to get ready.
Hey, Rahul, was there any thoughts that you have as well that you may want to share from a startup perspective and legal as well that you come across that maybe hasn't been covered? It might be relevant for the participants.
It's Rahul in the room. I don't see his name there. Is Rahul left the building?
Okay.
I can actually see a few other webinars coming out from the discussion. Maybe we should have a separate one for sales, for pre-revenue startups.
Right.
What is sales? Could be idea validation and yeah, something along that line. Sam has a question. Can you see that, Indra? Sam's question. Yeah, I think
this is where you're proposing two of the presentations, right? One is due diligence by investors, right? I think is a good idea.
Yeah.
And by startups.
No, definitely a good topic for conversation. Yeah. And as I've said to Sam, that if he's asking that for the basis of his own startup, to contact us, individually and privately. And on that note, I'll just say that we offer a 30-minute free consultation for anybody that wants to contact us, and we offer a 20% discount in fees for members of Silicon Beach. So you can find our contact details on the meetup site, or I've shared all of our LinkedIn links in the chat there. So yeah, please get in touch.
Yeah, I see I see in the chat as well from you, like you're asking for an early sales webinar as well. Could you expand on that as well?
Yeah.
Maybe some areas.
Yeah, I think early sales, pre-sales, pre-revenue, sales for pre-revenue startups would be a good topic.
Okay. I'll take note of that as well.
Yeah.
That's almost coming down saying, how do you get your first customer? How do you hire your first salesperson? Right. Even before that, right? How do you do that?
Yeah.
That's a challenge.
Because it all comes to idea validation, because a lot of our startups, I see that happen time and time again, because they're tech people, they're very enthused about the product they can build. So they build something without even doing the basic due diligence, whether there's a need for this product that they're building. Are they solving a problem?
Yeah, and it's also going to be very different in terms of if you're trying to approach mid-market SMB, if you're approaching enterprise, if you're going B2C, like it's all very different as well in terms of from a early sales perspective of how you approach that, right?
Yeah. I'm taking some screenshots of the chat because I find that even though Zoom saves the chat, it doesn't save it all sometimes, and I'm left with only partial part of the chat. So we should be able to answer or address some of those questions afterwards. If there are no more questions, we could then close the... I'll anyway stop the recording. Thanks everyone, the team from Allied as well as people attending. I'll just stop the recording. Thank you, and